That's a good line.
Insta360 sent me their new Go 2 camera to review. I've been using it for a few weeks now, so let's get right into it. Everything that you're about to watch in this video is filmed on my Go 2. My goal with this video is to show you a lot of sample clips and show you how I've processed them and what options there are available to the end user, so that you can really make your own decision and see what you think of this camera. I didn't realize this at first, but Insta360 at this point to me is almost more of a software company than a hardware company. The raw footage that comes from the camera looks something like this, and then everything gets post-processed based on what specific settings you want using either the mobile or desktop app. At the end of this video, I'll go through a list of pros and cons, and I'll tell you who I think this camera is designed for, and then I'll leave you off with a top to bottom post-processed run down BOOGIEMAN. Now this is not a paid advertisement, this is an unbiased review, and I'm sure you're good at using Google, so I'm not going to go over all of the specs, but I do want to go over a couple of key features of the Go 2 first. First thing is that it weighs 26.5 grams, which is extremely impressive and really quite amazing that they were able to fit so many things into such a tiny package. Now that's without the charge case, which is something that you actually will need to bring along with you if you plan on doing more than one run. Go 2 can film up to 1440p and 50 FPS. One of the coolest things that I think is on this camera is the fact that you can adjust in post whether you're shooting in landscape or portrait mode. There's no need for any funny mounts anymore, there's no need to commit to one shot or the other, as the post-processing algorithm is able to remap the pixels to whatever you want, be it landscape, portrait, or square format. I've never actually seen anything like this before in either a DSLR or an action camera, so this is pretty cool and opens up a lot of creative avenues that we'll explore later in this video. To mount the Go 2 to my helmet, I've chosen to use the magnetic prong mount, which clamps onto any standard action mount, and then the camera just snaps in with a magnet to the mount. The magnet's held up just fine, and I've never had any issues with it coming out. For your reference, the Go 2 costs $399 Canadian dollars, and the mount adapter bundle costs $25 Canadian dollars. So let's talk about stabilization. The default stabilization algorithm is called flow state, and honestly, I think it does a really good job of stabilizing the footage. It's really interesting to see what the raw footage looks like compared to what the processed version looks like, because it is truly a world of difference. I would say the stabilization is more than sufficient and really shows off the trail quite well. There's also another setting that I just switched to called FPV mode, which I gather is for FPV drone flying. And on slow technical trails that aren't overly, stabilization intensive, it does a very similar job. I don't really notice much of a difference. But the one thing that it does do is it tends to prioritize roll over pitch and yaw, which is something that's often used in drones for cinematography purposes, but not really used in the cycling world. And once we go onto a higher speed flow trail, like you're about to see right here on Empress Bypass, you're going to see the difference that I'm talking about. So in flow state mode, the horizon is kept relatively level, which probably is relatively easy given that it's a square sensor and you get a full sense of the horizon. So as I go through these berms following Nick, you'll see that the camera doesn't really tilt, but rather the bike tilts in the shot. This is pretty much how I'm used to stabilization algorithms working, and honestly, it's pretty satisfying. But when I switch in a second to FPV mode, you're going to see that the camera immediately leans over there, and now roll is a much more important aspect of the footage. It's cool to see how I actually lean into the corners rather than just seeing the bike leaning over in the corner of the shot. But I feel that the FPV mode struggles a little bit with riding because it tries to smooth out the footage a little bit too much and makes it look a little bit mechanical. I think I would go with flow state most of the time, but this FPV mode is pretty interesting, especially if you're on a flow trail and you're a relatively smooth rider. Now let's talk about the next setting in Insta360 Studio, which Insta360 calls FOV options. Basically, the image that comes from the camera is a circle, and the way that the circle is transformed into a rectangle that you watch is what I'm going to call lens correction from my old Photoshop days. It's kind of like how there are different map projections of the Earth, and each of the 4 lens corrections available in landscape mode excels in its own unique way. What you've been watching up to this point is what Insta360 calls Action View. And Action View is my personal favorite lens correction as it provides a nice balance between a wide field of view while still looking relatively natural toward the edges and the corners. Next up is Ultra Wide, which despite its name actually has a narrower vertical field of view than Action View. This is by far the most natural setting that's offered, although I have a hard time fitting both the trail and my bars in the shot. I could probably frame things better by just lowering the camera physically, but I feel that Action View does a better job of portraying the actual speed of the ride. On the other end of the spectrum, we have Linear. And Linear is quite a cool setting, and something that I've actually kind of grown to like. I feel that Linear does an excellent job of showing off both the speed and trail gradient at the expense of some trail roughness and distortion losses at the corners of the frame. I'd be curious to hear what you think of this setting, as it's just so much different from what I usually have. Now for a quick comparison. On the left side of the screen you can see action view, and on the right side of the screen you can see ultra wide. You can see that there's a pretty noticeable difference in the vertical field of view of both of these settings, but on the edges you get the same perception of speed. When compared to linear, however, you can see that the sense of speed is much higher, but there is a fair bit more distortion compared to action view. There is also a fourth setting, it's called narrow, and I don't see why you'd ever use that in a mountain biking application, so I didn't even render it out.
That was a hard one.
If you're filming in portrait mode, then ultra wide is typically the way to go because action view is not an option. Speaking of portrait mode, this is probably my favorite feature of the Go 2 because I can do things like this, where I switch between landscape and portrait almost magically, and it really adds a unique creative element to the video. Now, I've never done anything like this before, but I feel that there are a lot of strong opportunities for interesting content that can be created with this method. Next, let's talk about our AI overlords. When you're exporting footage from Insta360 Studio, they give you two options, remove grain and color AI. As you can see in this shot right here, on the left side it is the raw footage, and on the right side I have selected the remove grain option. This is a pretty hard test for the camera because it's very low light. You can see the sun is setting in the background. Personally, I feel like the remove grain option is a little bit too aggressive for my tastes, and I found that I actually got better results if I sharpened the raw footage rather than removing the grain. It is really nice though, and if it was any darker outside, I think the remove grain option is a super easy and intuitive option that will produce better footage. On to the other export option, which is color AI. But first, let's backtrack a little bit. I've been really happy with the raw colors that come straight from this camera. I wear a lot of bright kit and I have a pretty bright bike, and I feel that the Go 2 has done an excellent job of representing that on the video. The raw footage is probably a little bit dark, which is mostly my fault because I believe I set -0.5 EV comp to avoid blowing out highlights. But Color AI did exactly what I would have done to this footage. It increased the contrast, increased the midtones, and really didn't touch the vibrance or saturation of the shot. If you don't know how to color grade or color process, I think that Color AI is a fantastic checkbox option and really does help make your footage stand out. I found that checking Color AI or remove grain in the export options increase the render time a fair bit, but they do a great job at what they're advertising, and if that's what you want, then Insta360 gets huge kudos from me for making it such a simple and easy process, something that is not the case in most professional video editing software.
Holy Nick. You are one loose unit.
Now let's talk about audio quality. And honestly, this is where the Go 2 surprised me the most. I'm pretty happy with the audio quality, with one big asterisk, and that is wind noise. This camera, especially with the magnetic prong mount that I used, suffers from some pretty severe wind noise when you're riding at speed. I don't personally mind wind noise, but I feel that over a full-length YouTube video of 10 or 15 minutes, that the wind noise could get a little bit draining. I have not tried any sort of wind sock or wind, I don't know, mustache, whatever you want to call it, to reduce the wind noise external to what I have been provided, and I think I'm going to try that in the future to see how far I can push it. Insta360 has two different audio corrections in their studio software in order to help mitigate wind noise. The first one is called Action Focus, which I gather is supposed to reduce wind noise but still allow you to hear things such as the tires on the ground or the snow crinkling under your ski boots. I found that on a trail like John Deere that is really quite fast and quite flowy, that it does too good of a job and you really don't hear much at all in the end. The other option available is called Voice Focus, and this is something that I gather was targeted towards someone like a vlogger who vlogs in a windy environment and you really want to hear them and what they're saying and what they're narrating, which is great, but for a mountain bike channel like me, I don't think that's what I'm after because I really value audio quality on my channel, and I really like that you can hear the sounds and just experience the ride in one more dimension than video. For any social media platform that isn't focused on producing long-form quality content, such as Instagram Reels or YouTube Shorts or TikTok, this audio quality is more than acceptable, especially if you overlay some sort of music into the background or some sort of meme track. I feel that long-form YouTube content is really the hardest test of audio quality, and for me, I would rely on an external mic or a mic on another camera.
That was so scenic with the sun.
Okay, I just said a lot of words in the last 9 minutes, and it's probably best that we sit down and summarize those into a pretty short, well, relatively short, list of pros and cons. Let's start off with the pros. The Insta360 is a very impressive camera for such a tiny and lightweight package. It does 1440p 50 FPS for only 26.5 grams, which still I don't understand how that makes any sense. It has very acceptable low light performance in both noise and stabilization, and its one button operation means you basically can't get it wrong. It's super simple. And the simplicity carries over from the hardware to the software too. The app, both mobile and desktop, is intuitive, easy to use, The lens corrections are both simple to apply and useful for creating different feels. The AI color grading option does a pretty good job for someone who uses mobile or doesn't want to learn how to color grade or doesn't have the time to do so. The ability to switch between landscape and portrait mode is very cool. It's something that I've never seen before, which is quite exciting because I don't actually know how to use it, and it really forces me to be more creative and think outside the box with what I'm making with this camera. I really enjoy that challenge, and I feel that the content will reflect positively in that. Two more minor pros that I want to mention are the magnetic action camera mount. It was a little bit scary to put the camera in there and trust that the magnet was actually going to hold it under such a, vibraty load, which is riding. But even after riding some incredibly rough trails, the camera is still securely in the mount. The reason I like it so much is that you don't have to remove the mount to charge the camera, and you don't have to put your helmet beside whatever outlet you have. Being able to maintain a consistent camera angle is huge to me. And the last pro I wanted to mention was the vibration motor. So instead of the usual symphony of beeps you hear when riding with friends, this action button, when you press it, there is a vibration motor that obviously vibrates, and then you can hear it in your helmet. I like that because it's very clear as to what's happening. You don't know if it's whether you beeped or your friend beeped. It's both clear and subtle what's going on with the camera. So let's move on to the cons now. The biggest con that I see is that this camera shoots 1440p max. For most social media, that's not a problem because it tends to be quite low resolution on Instagram or TikTok or Shorts. But on YouTube with longer form content, 1440p just doesn't cut it these days. There are definitely still uses of the Insta360 GO in my workflow, be it a secondary camera or an alternate angle, but as a primary camera, it doesn't achieve that function. But it also doesn't try to do that. The next con is one that confuses me a little bit, but you can't actually shoot 60 FPS on this camera, which is something that my YouTube channel has really revolved around over the past few years. It's funny because you can shoot the PAL equivalent of 60, which is 50, but they didn't include that extra setting. Hopefully they'll do that in the software update because then it'll look much smoother blended in with my regular camera. The audio quality is generally quite good, but it does suffer from some wind noise at higher speeds. I'm going to see if I can mitigate this by gluing something onto the outside of the mic. Battery life is something we haven't talked about yet, and if you only do 1 or 1.5 laps, I call them laps, per ride, then it's not going to be a problem, and all you need to bring is the camera module. But as soon as you start doing 2 or 3 or 4 laps, you're going to have to bring the charge case with it, and you're going to have to charge it in between laps. The camera itself is waterproof, the charge case is not waterproof, and I imagine that means the charge case is not sweat-proof either, so need to be a little bit careful there. It's also worth mentioning that the GO has no expandable storage option, and what's internal to the camera is all you get. Once that's full, you're going to have to transfer it over via a USB-C cable to your desktop or wirelessly through the app to your phone. So I guess it's time to wrap things up here, and the best way to do that I know is to try to answer the question of who is the Insta360 GO really for? And that's a hard thing to answer. I think that the Insta360 GO is an excellent gateway camera into the POV world. Once you assign the action button to your preferred settings, it's extremely simple to operate both the camera and the app and quickly export high quality footage. The highest praise that I can give this camera is that it is genuinely fun to use. Everything has been quite a seamless experience, and there haven't been any headaches, which is not the same for all action cameras on the market. If your goal is to create content for Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts, or TikTok, I think that this camera should be toward the top of your list. For me personally, the resolution of 1440p is not quite high enough to replace my main camera setup, given that YouTube is my primary platform, but I could certainly see myself using the GO to add a second unique angle to the videos. On days where I don't intend on filming a full production video, I'll probably only bring the GO along, just due to its simplistic and tiny form factor, and see what I can record with it. I really like the creative aspect of being able to flip between landscape and vertical video, and it's just fun. It's a fun camera. If you like what you see, then there will probably be a link in the video description. I'd love to hear your initial thoughts on this camera, and really what you thought about this video in the comment section. These review style videos are pretty new to me. I've never actually done one before, but it was quite fun to do, and I really enjoyed getting to familiarize myself with a new product and trying to figure out the vocabulary to really convey how I feel about it. And with that, I will leave you with a scenic top to bottom run of Boogieman post-process to the best of my abilities. Hope you enjoy following Nick and Braden on this beautiful day.
Oh my God.
Oh, that's scary.
What, Braden stopped?
He was going a little faster.
This looks awful today. Oh!
That whole thing was a disaster.
That was awful. Oh my God. Excuse me? Nice. That's a good line. Oh my God, Nick.